there was a want to talk about this topic. There was a need to talk about this topic. So that really started our partnership with ACE Interface and Indiana Youth Services Association. So a little bit later on in the year, Dr. Robert Anda actually came out and trained the first 25 master trainers in ACE Interface, which is the presentation that you're going to see today. And Dr. Robert Anda developed this presentation himself. And just a little bit of a roadmap, we're going to go over the neurobiology of trauma, so talking about some sensitive periods of the brain, different parts of the brain, and how that trauma can affect the brain. We're also going to talk about the original ACE study and some important findings. We'll talk a little bit about how to foster resilience in kids that we work in and, in our friends and our family. And then we'll talk a little bit about how we can kind of start that process of building a trauma-informed organization as well as a community. I was lucky enough to be in that second group of 25 master trainers that were trained by Dr. Robert Anda. So in total, we have about 50 master trainers, and we have a Train the Trainer series coming up in October, which is very exciting. So today, we are going to be talking about our memories and our experiences. And from the first moment that we are formed and our body starts to, build that tiny beating heart and our cells start to divide, our memories and our experiences are stored in our bodies. And that wasn't always the way that we thought about this process. A lot of the time when we thought about our memories and experiences, we sometimes thought, okay, well, they can affect us in different ways. They can affect our brains in different ways. However, this idea of them being quite literally stored in our bodies and affecting the way that our brain develops and affecting the way that our body works is really a newer science that we're still trying to fully understand. So today we're going to be talking about discovery. We're going to be talking about two researchers that really went against the grain and what was happening in the scientific world at the time. When they came out with the original ACE study, they were totally laughed at. Nobody took this study seriously whatsoever. But as the research has continued, we've realized that they were spot on with what they were looking at and their epidemiological study, which we'll talk about in a bit. But I really just kind of challenge each of you to think outside the box when we talk about this research, and also think about how it applies to your daily work. Think about how this research really changed our fields and how it applies to so many different systems that we work in, not only when we talk about healthcare, but also education and the justice system and social services. There's so many different areas that this research affects. A fun fact of the day, I did get Invisalign last week. So if you're hearing a little bit of a lisp, that is why. So I'll apologize ahead of time because I'm still getting used to talking with the Invisalign. So sorry if that kind of gets in the way a little bit. So these are the two researchers that we'll be talking about today. The left is Dr. Robert Anda and the right is Dr. Vincent Felitti. And what was really interesting is that these two researchers were not at all working together when they kind of came about this idea. Dr. Robert Anda was actually studying women who were struggling with depression and were trying to quit smoking. And he would interview these women who were struggling to quit smoking, trying to identify the factors into why they were struggling so much to quit. And then he would come back 10 years later and he would revisit the same subjects, and he would ask them, how were you successful? Were you not successful? And what he found was that those individuals that were really struggling with depression and had a past of childhood trauma were not successful in quitting cigarettes because it was being used as a coping mechanism. At the same time, Dr. Vincent Felitti was studying and interviewing women that were struggling with obesity. And ironically, he kind of landed on this body of work by a mistake during one of his interviews. So normally he would ask the subjects that he was working with, at what age did you become sexually active? And he made a mistake this day and instead how much did you weigh when you became sexually active? And the answer was like something like 40 pounds. So he started to dig a little bit deeper and realized that a lot of these women that were struggling with obesity had also been victims of child sexual abuse. So not only was the food that they were eating a coping mechanism for that abuse, but it was also a protective factor against unwanted sexual advances. So they kind of looked at these two studies, and they had presented these studies at the CDC, and they thought, this is kind of similar. We're seeing some similar factors in the fact that there's a source to some of these problems. So they got together and created the ACEs study. It was the largest study of its kind with over 17,000 study participants. And this ACE study confirms with scientific evidence that adversity early in life increases physical, mental, and behavioral problems later in life. So we'll talk about that study in a bit, but these are the two gentlemen that we'll be focusing on today. But first, let's talk about the human nervous system. And I know that some of this can be a little bit difficult to get through. I promise I'll try to make it interesting for you. So with the human nervous system, this really orchestrates how our body works. In a matter of seconds, we are taking in that sensory information. Our body is understanding it with the goal of helping us to survive. And then we are putting it back out into the world around us. And this central nervous system consists of our brain, it consists of our spinal cord, it consists of our nerves, but really specifically, we're going to be focusing on our neurons today. So as you can see from the screen, this is a list, kind of a side-by-side view of neural pathway connections. So when we're born, we are born with very few neural pathway connections, only the connections that we need to eat, to sleep, to connect to a caregiver. So really only those things that we need to stay alive. As we grow up and we get to about age 6, all of these connections are formed. And that's because our neural pathways are created and strengthened by experiences. So repeated experiences, we have really, really strong neural pathways. However, as we grow from about age 6 to age 12 or 13, there's this process called pruning, where a lot of these neural connections start to die off and disappear. So those connections that haven't been repeated, those experiences that haven't been repeated, start to die off and be pruned away. And those experiences that have been repeated, those connections that have strengthened, will remain in our brain and in our bodies. And we can really start to understand through this process why something like adverse childhood experiences can be so detrimental, especially when we talk about these sensitive ages, when this is occurring in our brains. So for a moment, I want you to imagine that there are two worlds. And I'm going to ask for some discussion here, so be prepared for that. So the first world is very dangerous. It's filled with a lot of trauma. So a person is constantly having to go through fight, flight, or freeze. And that individual is really surviving some of the worst conditions. What do we think are going to be some characteristics of individuals that grow up on that first rung? So that very dangerous and trauma-filled world. And go ahead and unmute yourself or drop it in the chat, whichever you prefer. Is anybody there?
Do you mind repeating your question? I can throw it in the chat as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's what kind of characteristics is that person who grows up on that top rung? What kind of characteristics are they going to show? So I see they will be prone to risky behaviors affecting their life skills. Absolutely. They may remain in a constant guarded state. They will constantly be on high alert, will have trouble forming long-lasting bonds with others. Absolutely. Shy and shut off from the world. Prone to substance abuse. Any others that we can think of? Develop mental health challenges like complex PTSD, depression, anxiety. Absolutely. Thank you, Brooklyn. Higher risk of physical illness. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Lori. And we're seeing some themes already. So that hypervigilance, that edginess, that may very much be there. A lot of struggle with mental health, excuse me, physical health. Absolutely. Thank you. So what about this bottom rung? If a person grows up on this bottom rung where they're very safe, they have that nurturing relationship, and they're really not surviving the worst conditions. They're really surviving, the best conditions, but they could be very vulnerable to some of those bad conditions if they're very new to those experiences. What are going to be some characteristics of individuals that grow up on that bottom rung? Too trusting. What other characteristics will we see? More ready to learn. Thank you, Leslie. Maybe a little bit sensitive sometimes, especially to stressful situations. So we're going to see some obvious differences between individuals that grow up on these two rungs. I think both could enter IPV relationships and may not be able to recognize the signs. Yeah, absolutely, Brooklyn. Thank you. So yeah, we're going to see some differences when it comes to individuals that grow up on these different rungs. But something that is really important when we talk about this process is that individuals that grow up on that top rung are often labeled very quickly. And more specifically, a lot of the time they're labeled with that idea of being maladaptive, which I don't love, because when we think about it, they are quite literally adapting to some of the worst conditions. So that idea of maladaptive is a very judgmental word. It comes with a lot of negativity. It can cause a lot of self-loathing for folks. And this idea of being labeled maladaptive, that also means that, oh, well, maybe they won't be successful in their lives, which so is not true. I mean, when we look at folks that have grown up in traumatic situations who have experienced some of the worst things a person can imagine, they also tend to be some of the most resilient, which we really want to keep that in mind. So again, I'm asking a question here, so you'll have to drop it in the chat or unmute yourselves. What are going to be some jobs where a person that has some of these characteristics, like being edgy, hypervigilant, emotionally detached, where is that going to be really good for them? What kind of role would be really good for them to be in? And I kind of gave you a hint with the picture, just a little hint. First responders, thank you, Holly. Yeah, absolutely. They're going to be really good in those high stress situations because they've been through it before. So they're already hypervigilant. They're already kind of prepared for danger lurking around any corner. So first responders, yeah, they may be really, really good at that. What are some other jobs that they may be really good at? Medical staff, therapists, CPS workers, absolutely, thank you. Yeah, and that doesn't mean that we're talking about folks that are like disassociated, right? We're just talking about individuals who have already experienced a lot of these stressful situations, so they know how to help. They know what, is good to hear in these scenarios. They know that maybe if they weren't treated well during that process, they know how to treat the person well that's experiencing this. They know what to say. They know how to comfort, which can be really, really helpful. So again, we just kind of want to stay away from that idea of labeling individuals, whether it be a label of maladaptive, of whatever the different labels can be, including an ACE score, which we'll talk about in a bit. We just really want to be wary of that. And we want to be looking at the whole person and all of those characteristics and be thinking about how this trauma can affect the brain and the body, but what tools and what resources can we help provide to make their lives a little bit easier? Because it's when we run into societal expectations that we really start to have problems, right? When biology collides with societal expectations and social expectations, we start to get into some trouble. So for example, that classic example of a kid who is diagnosed with ADD or ADHD being placed in a classroom and being told to sit still, you can't move, you can't talk to anybody. That's not a realistic situation for that child because that's not how their brain and their body works. So it's creating simple adaptations that can really help make all the difference in these scenarios. So there was a study done by a man named Dr. Martin Teicher, who compared the brains of children who had been abused and neglected to the brains of those who had not. And what he found were that there were three main areas that really time and time again showed kind of the same responses to trauma based on these three things. So it was the type of maltreatment, the gender of the individual, and then the age in which the trauma occurred. Again, those were the three main areas that really helped Dr. Martin Teicher and helped the researchers see kind of those same responses and those same changes to the brain. So when we think about age, for example, well, age is really important when we're talking about brain development because our brain really develops in sequential order. As we talked about in the beginning, we're born with those neural pathways that we need to survive. So we're born with those things like eating and sleeping and connecting to a caregiver. And as I mentioned previously, the more experiences that we have, the more that brain is going to develop and the more that those pathways are created and strengthened. So age is really important when we're talking about brain development, but also when we're talking about how that trauma affects these different brain regions and at what ages specifically cause really specific changes to the development and the function of that part of the brain. So let's first talk about the limbic system. The limbic system is so important when we're talking about that fight or flight process. And as you can see, our limbic system is very important for our everyday world. It's vital for learning and memory, reward, and reinforcement. And it also helps regulate our hormones, our mood, our heartbeat, and our sexual behavior. And when we look a little bit closer at the limbic system, we have specifically the amygdala and the hippocampus. And these really house that fight, flight, or freeze process, that panic and fear, attention, memory, and social cues. And this part of the brain is really vital for relationships. So for a moment, I want you to imagine that you are in the woods and you come across a bear. What's going to start to happen in your limbic system is that your amygdala is going to start firing off adrenaline and cortisol. So it's going to start firing off these chemicals and these hormones. It's going to send messages to your heart to start racing a little bit faster. It's going to send oxygen to your muscles so you can get ready to fight or you can get ready to run from the bear. And it's actually going to send messages to your prefrontal cortex. So that part of our brain that's in charge of executive functioning, for logical reasoning. And it's going to say, we don't need you right now. I don't need you logicking out how you are going to survive this bear. I just need you to survive. So it sends all the chemicals away from the prefrontal cortex, and that amygdala keeps on pumping that cortisol and that adrenaline, and our hippocampus is recycling those chemicals. And that's wonderful if we run into a bear in the woods. But what if that bear lives with us? And we're going through this process over and over and over again, day in and day out. That is where we can see a lot of damage to the limbic system. Specifically, maltreatment, that is in utero to about age 3, can be very damaging to the amygdala and the hippocampus. And sexual abuse that occurs about when you're born to age 5 can also be very damaging to the amygdala and the hippocampus. Not only when it comes to the actual size and the development of this part of the brain, but also the blood flow to this part of the brain. And if we're talking about those kids that have experienced adverse childhood experiences, a lot of the time they happen together. So they're experiencing multiple traumatic situations. Well, what's really interesting about the hippocampus is that we're born with these things called seedling cells within the hippocampus, and seedling cells do not fully develop and do not really develop until about the age 13. Cortisol is quite literally toxic to these seedling cells and will actually kill the seedling cells off. And we may not see some of these effects until the kids start to hit puberty. And maybe you've worked with a kiddo that you've seen this happen, where they've seemed to be fine as they've been developing, but all of a sudden when they hit puberty, it's like a completely different person. And not only can that be because of the hormones that are pumping, it can also be because of past trauma that has occurred. So it's always a great idea to dig a little bit deeper and find out what's going on. Do I have any questions about the amygdala and the hippocampus and the limbic system in general? Is everyone still awake, or have I lulled you to sleep with the brain talk? Hopefully not. So the next part of the brain that we're going to be talking about is the cerebellar vermis, and this connects the two halves of the cerebellum. This is a very important part of our brain that's in charge of our positive feelings. So those chemicals like norepinephrine and dopamine. It helps us with perception. It helps us with attention. And what's really, really interesting is that scientists are actually finding that this part of the brain is quite literally the seat of all mental health challenges. So they are finding that this part of the brain is connected to depression, to anxiety, to schizophrenia, to addiction struggles, to ADD and ADHD. It's all housed in this part of the brain. And there's so much we still don't know about this part of the brain, and that they're still trying to research and figure out. But we do know that this is a really, really important part of the brain that also has those seedling cells that I mentioned before. So we're also seeing that common link of those seedling cells being involved in a lot of these parts of the brain. Then we have the corpus callosum, which is basically the superhighway of the left and right hemisphere parts of the brain. As you all know, the left and right hemisphere is very, very important for our daily functioning. It is in charge of basically everything that we do. And with the corpus callosum, neglect in infancy and sexual abuse around age 9 or 10 can be deeply affecting that corpus callosum. Not only is it affecting the development of that part of the brain, but it quite literally affects the electrical signaling in our brain. So that cross-brain communication can be quite challenging for individuals that have grown up in trauma. And you may know an individual that has some of these effects. So, for example, an individual that has a really tough time calming down if they are triggered, that may not be, their normal self. That may be quite literally a response, an adaptation to the trauma that they experienced. And there's ways that we can help the brain, and there's ways that we can assist these individuals so that we can help them be more successful and feel more safe and more loved as they're kind of growing up. All right, so as we kind of talked about, there are different regions of the brain that are very sensitive to trauma, especially around specific ages. Not only does it affect the development of our brain, but also the way that our blood flow gets to our brain, the way that our electrical signaling works. So we start to see some of those characteristics that we talked about in the beginning of the presentation. We start to see a lot of hypervigilance. We start to see edginess. We start to see maybe an individual that's prone to anger or who's struggling with mental health challenges. And we also see folks who are struggling with addiction. And a lot of this can be traced back to that brain science and the way that this trauma affects the brain and the body. If you haven't read The Body Keeps the Score yet, highly recommend it. It is a wonderful book that goes into great detail about a lot of these different areas. And we also talked about that prefrontal cortex and how the amygdala sends messages to that prefrontal cortex and says like, hey, we don't need you right now. And all of those hormones and those chemicals are being sent away from the prefrontal cortex. And that's really important to keep in mind, because when we're talking about the development of our brains and we're talking about executive skills and executive functioning and logic, a lot of those things are going to be affected because of that constant fight, flight, or freeze process. So a lot of these executive skills that you see on the screen, some individuals are going to be really, really great at some of these areas, at emotional control and memory and sustained attention. Others are really, really going to struggle when it comes to some of these areas because of the way that their brain has developed and because of the experiences that they've had. So we also want to keep that in mind, not only as we're serving individuals, but when we're talking to our coworkers, when we're talking to our staff, because a lot of us get into these fields because we ourselves have experienced some sort of trauma and we want to help. We want to make a difference. So we also want to keep this process in mind as we're going through our daily lives. And we all have that collective choice. We can sit here and we can continue to go down this road of not really making those simple adaptations, not really understanding the brain science and how that can affect folks. And, perhaps putting on those labels that we talked about in the beginning and being judgmental, or we can go down a different road and we can help make those simple adaptations and we can try to limit our judgment. And we can also start to identify our own dysregulated stress response system, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and how important it is for us to be knowledgeable of our own triggers when we're working with folks. So an example of a simple adaptation that can be made that can make all the difference. This target was created by a high school principal who was really struggling with kids who were dropping out and a lot of disciplinary action in school. So he realized that these adolescents were not made to be logical at the same time that they were emotionally triggered. So he created this chart. And whenever there was a disciplinary conversation that had to happen, he would come to the kid with this chart and he would say, point to where you're at. If they were in the red, they would wait hours or even up to a day to have a conversation. If they were in the yellow, they would wait a few hours to talk. If they were in the green, they were ready to talk. And just from this simple target, the high school principal saw an 85% drop in suspensions in his school, which is huge. When we think about how that affects the graduation rates, when we think about how that's less kids being involved in the criminal justice system, less kids getting involved in things outside of school that aren't great. And it also helped the kids feel like they were part of the school community, that they weren't just being labeled yet again, that they were able to be respected and listened to, which can make all the difference in these scenarios. And that's just from a simple target. And that's really, really important as we keep on talking about this process, because this trauma and ACEs can affect our very genes. So there's a new science that has come about called epigenetics. I will not go into great detail about this because I am not a scientist. However, epigenetics is basically the study of how these experiences and this trauma quite literally get under our skin. So our DNA remains pretty similar throughout the generations. However, scientists have found that traumatic experiences can reshape and change the reading of our DNA. So this is where a lot of those physical illnesses start to come in, where we start to see a lot of physical health challenges in folks that have experienced a lot of trauma, because quite literally down to our very cells, our cells in our bodies are being changed. And this can really help us understand why things like historical trauma can affect different communities in very different ways. We can start to understand why we see generations in families repeat the same struggles, mental health challenges, addiction. And you yourself may have seen this in the family. For example, throughout the generations, I have seen a huge struggle of my relatives when it comes to alcoholism. And time again, we see those relatives being very much prone to that struggle with alcoholism. So really keep this in mind, that not only is this trauma affecting different brain regions and how our brain develops, how that electrical signaling works, how that blood flow works, but it's changing our very cells in the way that they are read, which is quite mind-blowing. And there's a great documentary on PBS called Ghost in Your Genes, which is all about epigenetics if you find this topic interesting and want to learn more. So for a moment, we don't have to write it down. Let's actually kind of put it in the chat or unmute ourselves. I want us to talk about how this science can be used in your field to create an improvement in people's lives, can help change the way that you're working on a daily basis. How does this science kind of make you think about changes that could be made and how you could be going about your interactions with folks a little bit differently? And I'll open up the chat here to see what folks say, or again, unmute yourselves. Yeah, it can make you more understanding of what other people have been through and are currently experiencing. Absolutely. Thank you, Becky. How does this change your daily work and the way that you go about your daily work? It can shift your perspective on the behaviors to recognize the reasons behind them. Thank you, Holly. Gentle approach with people. No, it's not all about me when working with someone. They may be experiencing feeling unsafe while talking with you, thus be gentle and meet people where they are without judgment. Thank you so much for that, Catherine. Absolutely. I think we should be quicker to recognize family history and validate those experiences, and that sometimes secondhand trauma. Yeah. It can also create connections between people in similar communities. I work with teens and I have been able to connect teens that are also Latinx because we share experiences. Absolutely. Thank you, Brooklyn. It can impact our assessment of program participants and help us to be more accurate in choosing interventions. Yes, absolutely. I foresee folks that have a history of trauma. A lot of the time, some of the programs and interventions that we're choosing aren't the most applicable to them, and focusing on specific trauma-focused interventions can make all the difference. Understanding historical trauma in the Native communities gives you the ability to recognize repeated behaviors and help to adapt programs to the needs of individuals and communities. Yes, thank you, Lori, absolutely. Historical trauma is a huge piece of this, and I think that it's a piece that we don't talk about enough during this presentation. I would love like a whole presentation about historical trauma, just because it's so important when we're talking about how that's passed through the generations and how our cells, change, and how individuals carry those experiences and those histories. It's so important to talk about when we're discussing adverse childhood experiences. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate hearing your opinion and your thoughts on that. It's greatly appreciated. So now we're going to kind of transition over. Hold on, we have one more. It could also impact policies used to determine how we treat program participants. Yes, yeah, especially when we're talking about, becoming that trauma-informed organization and that trauma-informed agency and that community. Policies are the first step of that, first and foremost. So yes, absolutely. Thank you, Leslie. So before we jump into the ACEs study, I want to briefly state that ACEs are not destiny. ACEs tend to create risk, but they are not someone's destiny, and they should not be treated as such. So understanding health behaviors, in the beginning, we talked about Dr. Robert Anda and Dr. Vincent Folletti, who were looking at smoking, looking at obesity, and how all of those linked back to experiences in childhood. So they really wanted to link together and dive a little bit deeper into this understanding. Whoops, sorry. And the question that they came up with was, does the risk for chronic health problems originate in childhood? And that was really the main question that they focused on during this study. And at the time, this was, again, all new information. So the things that were being focused on at that point in time were the three top areas of this pyramid. So health risk and behaviors, disability, disease and social problems, and early death. What Dr. Robert Anda and Dr. Vincent Folletti did was that they added these three bottom areas to this pyramid. So the understanding of historical trauma and intergenerational trauma, adverse childhood experiences, social, emotional, and cognitive functioning. In addition, they added these two areas as well. So that understanding of neurodevelopment and epigenetic influences, symbol adaptations that could be made, so that could affect the health risk and behaviors, the disease, disability, and social problems, and then hopefully limiting that early death. Again, they were completely laughed at when this science came out. Nobody believed what they were saying. But as we've continued to do more work, especially around trauma and ACEs, again, they were spot on with what they came out with. So these were the 10 adverse childhood experiences that were studied in that population. Again, it was 17,000 participants. So I think in total, after all of these interviews, they had about 53 adverse childhood experiences, but they limited it to the 10 most common in those study participants, which is what you see on your screen. This in no way is all of the traumatic experiences that one can have throughout their childhood. Obviously, we see some big ones that are not on here: discrimination, racism, if you're LGBTQIA, being, perhaps disowned by your family. There's lots of traumatic scenarios that can occur because trauma is very subjective, which is really important to keep in mind. But these were the 10 most common in those 17,000 participants. Something that's really important to state is that this was not a diverse study. The majority of the 17,000 participants were white, college-educated, middle-class folks living in San Diego, California. So that's really important to keep in mind when we look at these numbers. Even though that was the population, we were still seeing very high rates of adverse childhood experiences. But keep that in the back of your mind to be thinking about the fact that these numbers would probably be much higher in other communities and in other individuals. So first, they looked at household dysfunction. So substance abuse, or someone living in the home that's struggling with substance abuse, parental separation or divorce, mental illness, domestic violence, or criminal behavior. They looked at neglect, emotional and physical, and then abuse, emotional, physical, and sexual. And that's how they kind of came up with that total 10 ACEs score. That is very common through the questionnaire that individuals fill out, that 10 question questionnaire, and get their ACE score. And what they found during this research was that ACEs were also highly interrelated. So where there was one ACE that occurred, usually there were others. 87% of the time, if there was one type of ACE, there was a second kind of ACE. So again, they occur together a lot of the time. So there's multiple traumatic experiences that are happening. So this is kind of a breakdown of what the researchers found in those 17,000 study participants. So 33% of them had an ACE score of 0. That does not mean that they did not have a traumatic experience in their life. It just means that traumatic experience was not one of those top 10 that we saw. 26% of them had a score of 1, 16% of them had a score of 2, 10% of them had a score of 3, and 16% of them had a ACE score of 4 or more. And when we talk about the ACE score, it's really important to talk about how this is really like an aerial shot view of someone's life. They really were creating that epidemiological study to help with public health. And the questionnaire has kind of been changed and shaped and formed, and a lot of the time it's used on an individual level, which can be fine. But let's talk about the uses of the ACE score, because this is a really important area that we want to talk about. So the ACE score is a really powerful research tool. It's very useful when it comes to measurements for public health studies. It's a measure of how adversity increases physical and mental health risks. It's a really helpful narrative history tool and communication tool, so it can really help open that door to understanding someone's history and understanding some of the experiences that they've had, and it helps create that common language. The ACE score should not be used as a diagnostic tool. It should not be used as a screening tool to determine services. It should not be used as a predictor at the individual level. And it should not be used as a fun quiz. And there's a reason that we bring each of those areas on the right up. And that's because, unfortunately, we are seeing this throughout the state of Indiana, that folks are using the ACE score to help with a diagnosis, that they're using this ACE score as a screening tool to determine services for that individual. And we're also hearing of school systems handing out the ACEs questionnaire to all of their students. The ACEs questionnaire asks very subjective, but also at the same time, triggering questions, right? We're talking about adverse childhood experiences. We are talking about past traumatic experiences for individuals that have been deeply effective on their brains and their bodies. Some individuals may not be at the stage where they are ready to dive deeper into some of those experiences. They may not be at the stage where they've fully understood what has happened to them. So the ACEs questionnaire, although it's a short one-pager, it's not a fun Cosmo quiz. This is not something that we like take on BuzzFeed. This is a deeply triggering and deeply effective questionnaire. So we don't want to use it as a fun quiz, but we also want to keep in mind that the ACEs questionnaire and the ACEs score does not take into effect the frequency or severity of the abuse. So let's break that down real quick. When we're looking at these numbers, okay, someone can have an ACE score of 2, and they could have had an adverse childhood experience one time each. So let's say they lived with someone for a brief amount of time that was struggling with substance abuse, and their mom had a partner that was abusive. Not to say that these are not deeply affecting, they absolutely are. But let's say that those each happened one time. Another person could have an ACE score of 2, and they could have been horribly physically and sexually abused every single day of their childhood, and their scores are the exact same. So again, this is an aerial shot of someone's experiences. It does not take into account the frequency or the severity of the abuse. So if we are giving out the ACEs questionnaire, we want to be prepared and ready for those conversations. We want to be ready to be listening and to be respectful, and also have those resources to give to folks so that we're not just giving them the ACEs questionnaire, giving them an ACEs score, which is yet another label, and then sending them on their way. We want to make sure that we have those resources there to help support that individual as well. Does that make sense, everybody? Do we have any questions about that? So I know that can be a lot of new information all at once. Let me know if there's any questions. So as they continued, oh, I see chat. It's clear. Perfect. Thank you, Lori. I appreciate it. So as they continued this research and they looked at these different health problems in relation to the ACE score, they found this dose response relationship. So the higher the ACE score, the more risk that they had to different mental and physical health problems. So one of the main ones that, they looked at was smoking and the different effects from smoking. And when we think about smoking, what's on the side of those cigarette packages that we see, may cause cancer, may cause lung cancer over and over again. However, what we don't see is, hey, there may be other ways that can help you with your anxiety. There may be other ways that can help you with your depression. We're not getting to the root of a lot of these health, social, physical, mental, all of these problems. We're not talking about the root of a lot of these challenges, which is really important. So these are some of the numbers for the ACE score and the different health problems that the researchers saw. So as you can see, the higher the ACE score, the more percentage of individuals that had that specific health problem, and that risk. So early smoking, current smoking, and COPD continued to rise, the higher the ACE score. ACE score in liver disease, as you can see, as that number continued to rise, so did the percentage of those with liver disease and the risk for liver disease. ACEs in depression, that percentage of those that were clinically depressed continued to rise, the higher the ACE score. One of the strongest relationships that they saw were ACEs and suicide attempts. So as you can see, there was a very high relation between attempted suicide and the higher ACE score. And these were a list that the researchers found. These were all examples that were found in those 17,000 participants in that sample. So they saw alcoholism and alcohol abuse, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, coronary heart disease, depression, drug abuse and illicit drug use, fetal death, intimate partner violence, liver disease, mental health problems, obesity, sexual behavior problems, smoking, unintended pregnancy, violence, and workplace problems. This is not an exhaustive list of all ACE attributable problems. I'm sure that this list could continue on. However, this was the main ones that they saw in those 17,000 participants. So I want you guys to kind of remember this cycle, that when there are high ACE scores in a population, the higher the risk for health problems. There is that increased risk of multiple health and social problems, the higher the ACE score. And then there's also that intergenerational transmission of trauma when we're not intervening and stopping that trauma from occurring throughout the generations. And we can really talk about the prevention side of a lot of these numbers. So this is the population attributable risk. And what this shows is the percentage of these specific challenges that could be prevented if we prevented ACEs. So that number that you see on the oil slick is the percentage of these different problems that could be prevented if we limited ACEs. So for example, 67% of suicides could be limited if we prevented adverse childhood experiences. 55.7% of anxiety could be limited if we prevented adverse childhood experiences. And you start to understand how all of these systems and all of these different health challenges are all linked back to our experiences in childhood. And that really gets us thinking about the prevention side of things. And, you know, we really want to remember that prevention when it comes to the accumulation of ACEs. We may not be able to prevent that first ACE from occurring, but we can certainly prevent a child. We can notice if they're an ACE score of 4, and we can prevent them to getting to 5, which can really make all the difference when we're talking about the percentage of health risk. And we really have the power to shift the dynamics that lead to high ACE scores. Nobody's waiting in the wings for what's, you know, occurring right now, especially with COVID and all of the trauma that is coming with that. We as adults have the power to really help limit the accumulation of ACEs. But before I jump into building resilience and fostering resilience in kids, do I have any questions about the ACEs study and the findings on that study, or the ACEs score and the ACEs questionnaire? Any questions about that whole process? Okay, perfect. Just wanted to make sure before I moved on. Okay, so when we talk about adverse childhood experience, one of the main things that we get is talking about resilience. This is always a really, really important topic to bring up. And, you know, when we talk about resilience, fostering resilience, oh, I'm sorry, I have a question. Has anyone ever done an ACE study of different racial groups? Yes, absolutely. There have been a few. I would highly suggest checking out Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris's research. Specifically, she wrote a book called The Deepest Well. She also has a TED Talk that's awesome. But she created the Center for Youth Wellness out in California. And all of her research around ACEs is wonderful. She's a pediatrician. So she kind of created this process of any time a family would come into her office, she would use the ACE questionnaire to see what was going on in the home, see some of the past trauma, but then she would immediately connect them to services, which is definitely the way to go about it, which is great. So her book talks a lot about ACEs research with different racial groups. It talks about, you know, the ACE study and how it affected the community and how it really shifted the community that she was working in as well. So I would definitely check out her research, Leslie. So yeah, there are three main areas that really help foster resilience, and that's going to be individual capabilities, attachment and belonging, and then community, cultural, spirituality. So when we talk about individual capabilities, we're really talking about that belief in oneself, so that self-efficacy and self-regulation. So self-regulation is such an important part of this. I'm just giving you guys like all the book ideas. There's also another book that is wonderful. Sorry, Jordan, I keep on making you type in the chat. That's called Self-Reg. And it is wonderful. It talks all about dysregulated stress response systems and different things that we can do, not only with our children, but also with ourselves, that really help us start to understand self-regulation and how we can identify our own triggers and how we can just really help the kids that we're working with and our own children as well. Anyway, so dysregulated stress response systems are quite common when we talk about kids that have experienced adverse childhood experiences and trauma. Some kids who even haven't experienced some of those ACEs can just be born genetically with a dysregulated stress response system. So it's really important to kind of keep that in mind when we're working with kids, when we have our own kids, and also be aware of it in ourselves, what our triggers are. You know, he talks about in the book how as human beings, it's in our nature that if someone is yelling at us and coming at us, that we want to respond back with yelling. And that's human nature for us to do that. But of course, in those situations can be one of the worst things that we can do, because it's just kind of creating more stress and more trauma. Thank you, Jordan, appreciate it. I always have like a billion book recommendations. I'm like, read all these things, watch all these things. So it's really important that we're talking about that self-regulation. So I know I may get like a couple of, oh God, but meditation and breathing is so important when we're talking about self-regulation. My nephew is younger and he has a very dysregulated stress response system. And one of the things I've been working with him on is called snake breathing. So it's this idea that you tell them to fill their belly up like a balloon when you're breathing in. And when they breathe out, you tell them to breathe out like a snake. So you, and you do this a couple of times, and it helps get their stress response system back in order. Some kids don't really love the breathing. Some kids would rather dance to some music to get a little bit more balanced. It really depends on the individual. And there's such a list of different self-regulation tools that you can do with your own kids, do with the kids that you serve, but it can really make all the difference when we're talking about building that resilience and building that belief in oneself, because it's showing that somebody's noticing them, it's showing that somebody's listening, and you're also identifying new and different coping mechanisms to help that child as they grow. Because especially if they haven't hit puberty yet, it's going to get more challenging as they kind of grow up and they start to experience a lot of those hormonal changes. So being able to identify some of those tools that really help them can be huge. With technology nowadays, there's so many options. So for example, for my nephew, I have an app on my phone called WonderGrade. And it really helps them learn breathing techniques with this little guy. And it has different exercises that they can do and different ways of breathing, of meditating, of relaxing. Because something that's really important to keep in mind that they talk about in the book is that there's a difference between being calm and being quiet. Nowadays, so often with technology everywhere, you know, we want to keep our kids quiet. So we hand them a cell phone, we hand them, you know, a tablet, video games, whatever it may be. And that helps keep them quiet. But in a lot of ways, it's not necessarily helping them keep calm. So that if we can build some of those tools, some of those coping strategies, we can build those individual capabilities, we can build that resilience, that belief in oneself, and really help regulate that system. And that's also important for ourselves, because a lot of the time, as I mentioned, we have our own triggers, we have our own dysregulated stress response system. So we also need to do the work to be aware of what those are. Like, I know for me, I do not react well when my nephew gets physically violent in his outbursts, kicking, slapping. I immediately start to panic and start to withdraw and become, you know, very angry. That is a trigger for me. And when it's happening in those moments, I have to take a step away. So also doing that work to be aware of our own triggers, of our own ways to self-regulate, can also be hugely important as well. So attachment and belonging is going to be that second step to really help foster resilience. Throughout all of the research that has been done on trauma and ACEs and attachment and belonging, researchers time and time again have found that all it takes is one positive relationship. One positive attachment in that child's life can make all of the difference when it comes to their future. So relationships with caring and competent people are vital contributors to resilience and recovery. And a lot of that time, we are that one positive relationship for them. When it comes to our own kids, when it comes to our nieces and nephews, whoever it may be, we may be that only positive relationship. So again, thinking about those interactions and those coping mechanisms and those tools can be hugely beneficial. ACEs Connections has changed its name to PACES. Yes, positive and adverse childhood experiences. Yeah, thank you, Lori. They have, which is so wonderful, because positive experiences, positive attachments, resiliency is a huge part of adverse childhood experiences. You know, we can't just talk about one part of this science. We also have to talk about the positive part. And that if we're building resilience and we're building individual capabilities, we're having that one positive relationship, that can make all the difference when we're talking about this science. So thank you, Lori, I appreciate it. So this third step is going to be this community, faith, and cultural processes. So this is really about building and fostering that thriving community of individuals and community members being respectful of each other's culture, faith, community practices, whatever it may be, understanding, learning more about those cultural processes, but also allowing space for there to be different beliefs, different ways of thinking, and really allowing that respect for those different faiths and those different cultural processes can be huge when we're talking about building resilience, because individuals can be seen, they can feel heard, and they can feel like they're a part of something bigger than just themselves. So this community capacity development piece is going to be the last part of the presentation. So really briefly, before I jump into that, I just want to make sure, do I have any questions about the fostering resiliency piece or any of the books that I've mentioned? Because I know I've mentioned a lot. Or maybe, you know, you yourself are aware of some tools to help build with resiliency and self-efficacy that I did not mention, that you can mention in the chat to help other folks. Okay, I'll keep an eye on it just in case somebody mentions it. So yeah, this next part, and it's going to be our last part, talking about community capacity development and building that trauma-informed organization. Really briefly, before we jump into the community capacity development piece, we cannot get to a place where we have a trauma-informed self-healing community until our own organization is trauma-informed. We can't reach the place where we can grow past that to get a community-wide trauma-informed process and policies until we ourselves are trauma-informed. There is a wonderful assessment that is through SAMHSA, that is their trauma-informed organizational assessment. Jordan, I can send this link to you as well. That it is designed and developed to be handed out to each individual in the organization. So higher ups all the way down, and that each person fill out this assessment, and then you come together for a longer conversation and see where you score, see how that assessment turned out, and in what areas the organization needs to improve, and what areas the organization is doing well, and then what steps to do after it. So that's actually something that the ACES Indiana Coalition offers. We have trauma-informed agency presentations, trauma-informed program presentation, and then communities presentation as well, where we can come to your organization, help you with the results of the assessment, and then have a larger presentation about next steps. Being trauma-informed is a very slow process. It's not a fast process whatsoever. But it really can make all the difference when we're serving individuals in whatever capacity to help them feel safe and to help them feel heard and seen. So I also want you to keep in mind of that organizational piece before we talk about the communities piece. So there are really 4 main steps that individuals who have built that self-healing community have really found to be the same throughout different areas. You know, communities are going to be different. Not every community is going to go through this process exactly the same, but these 4 main areas have been included in whatever a community has done. So the first one is going to be leadership expansion. And this doesn't mean that every single person gets a fancy title and gets more responsibility. What it means is that you're bringing everybody to the table, right? We can't walk into a community that we're not personally a part of and expect to know what they need. We have to bring everyone to the table of different backgrounds, of different perspectives, and we have to listen to one another. We have to identify what individuals' passions are, and we have to help them kind of foster that passion. So if there's something that they are passionate about on this journey to become trauma-informed and self-healing, what can they do to be a part of it? What can we do to foster that passion and give them a role in this process so that they feel like they're a part of it? So it's about bringing everybody to the table and listening to those opinions and really hearing folks with their opinions and what the community needs. The second part is going to be coming together around issues that matter. So whether it be holding, ACE interface presentations in the community, or holding trauma-informed, program presentations in your organization, it's about bringing people together around issues that matter so that you can stimulate that discussion, you can have that camaraderie, which is so important when you're talking about building that trauma-informed space, whether that be in an organization or whether that be in a community. And that third part is that shared learning that happens when you bring people together around issues that matter. When we're sharing in that learning, we're feeling connected to folks, we're learning about different perspectives and different opinions, and that can really, really help bring people together, even if it's on a virtual platform such as this one. And this last one is results-oriented decision-making. And what's really important about this step is that it's not about shaming what individuals have done in the past. It's about examining some of the things that have been done in the past, figuring out what has worked, and then looking at what has not and moving forward. So it's not about judgment. It's not about, loathing and complaints or anything like that. It's looking at the things that have been successful, moving those towards, the present, and figuring out how that can help communities and organizations move forward as they become more trauma informed. And cultural respect and continuity is so vital when we're talking about this. You know, as I mentioned previously, this was not a diverse study. They did not look at racism and discrimination and how that affected individuals. But research has been done since then to show that those areas are just as deeply affecting as any of the adverse childhood experiences that you saw on your screen. So we also really want to keep in mind how important the understanding of historical trauma is, of you know, this cultural respect is incredibly important when we're talking about building those self-healing communities, building that trauma-informed organization, and really moving this process forward to help folks feel more safe and connected. And that's really what all of this is about, is lifting all beings up, listening to each other, really hearing each other, being respectful of each other, and moving towards that trauma-informed process and that trauma-responsive process. And that change is really up to us. You know, it is shaped by our thoughts, our conversations, the way we relate with one another in relationships, in families, and in communities. So with this neuroscience, you're able to move forward with the understanding of how this trauma affects the brain and the body. With the ACEs study, you can understand how those traumatic experiences create risk for different health problems. We can start to understand how to foster resilience and help folks who have been affected by ACEs. And then we can really help our organization and our community become more trauma informed. So the ACEs Indiana Coalition is here to help with whatever you may need. If you yourself at your organization are wanting an ACE interface presentation, please feel free to go to our website. If you have questions about any of the resources that I've mentioned today, please feel free to reach out to me, as well as, you know, the trauma-informed assessment or additional presentations. If you're wanting your organization to become more trauma-informed, but you need a little bit of assistance, please let us know. We are a group of professionals from across the state of Indiana that have varying backgrounds in different systems. So we really bring unique perspectives, and we're really help with evidence-based research to help kind of move forward towards that trauma-informed process. So I know I've ended a little early, but please let me know if you have kind of any questions as we're ending the presentation. And I'll kind of hand it off over to Jordan again.
Thank you so much, Jessica. We appreciate it. It does look like there was a question that came in kind of late earlier in the presentation. It was, do you have any resources for self-regulation activities for young ones?
Yeah, so that self-reg book is going to be huge because it talks a lot about those different tools. I also have a handout that I can send to you that, like, for example, it talks about the snake breathing that I mentioned, but it talks about a few other activities that you can do with younger children. And it really is like a step-by-step process that I can send out to folks as well.
Awesome, thank you. I wasn't sure if that had been covered or not. If anyone has any other questions, please feel free to put those in the chat or to raise your hand if you'd like to ask verbally. I know that this was a question that came up in a previous training that was around the same topic, and I'm curious what your thoughts are. The question this person asked was, how do you recommend responding if a student, since a lot of these folks on the call work with youth, if you're in class and a student or teen discloses trauma to you, like in front of the whole group, how would you recommend responding to that?
Well, I think one of the biggest things is finding a safe and non-judgmental way of getting them away from the group first. Because one, we don't know how the group is going to respond to what they're disclosing. We don't know if there will be like insults thrown around. We don't know if there will be judgment. And we also don't know if someone in the room will be triggered themselves. So it's really important to kind of separate them from what's going on. I think the best thing is that if you have a social worker in your school or a counselor in your school, is connecting to them to that counselor or that social worker. I know not everybody does, so I know that that can be challenging. But the biggest thing is, again, listening to what they're saying, not, interrupting them, not judging them for what they're saying, really listening to what they're saying, and then responding in that non-judgmental way, not making promises we can't keep. So not, if the trauma is currently occurring, not saying, I'm going to promise that this will never happen to you again. We don't want to say things like that. But just explaining that you believe them, that you hear them, and you are going to do everything in your power to help them. So whether that be connecting them to the counselor or connecting them to resources outside the school. But yeah, I think that you handle that very similar to any kind of disclosure, like the sexual abuse disclosure that would happen when I worked at Chauncey's place. The goal is to separate them from the classroom so they're not speaking on that in front of people, making sure that they're in a safe environment when you can have a deeper conversation, listening, not interrupting them, not responding with judgment, explaining that you believe them, not making promises that we can't keep, but then also making sure that we're following up with resources. That can be hugely important.
Awesome, thank you. I'll give folks just a few more minutes to think about any questions they might have. And if you'd rather ask your question anonymously, feel free to send either myself or Jessica a direct message. In the meantime, while you all are thinking, I'll go ahead and throw the evaluation for this training into the chat. You can click on it there, and then I will also be sending that link in an email after this training, as well as I will write up the list of books that Jessica recommended, as well as the app that she mentioned. And then Jessica, if you have any other resources, definitely feel free to send them my way and I can get them out to folks. But I'll just take a few more seconds if anyone has any last minute thoughts or questions.
Yeah, and I'll make sure to send you the trauma-informed assessment as well. That way, if folks want that, they can use it as too.
Awesome. And I will just do a little plug for our online learning as well. Feel free to go to learn.hcet.org, I want to say. I can find the website for that, but we have lots of online learning modules as well. So feel free to check those out, as well as check out our website for recorded webinars. We have a lot of similar trainings or webinars on this topic. All right. Looks like folks are starting to drop off. Yeah, if you have any other questions that you think of later, feel free to email them to me. I'll send them over to Jessica, but thank you all for being here.